Yes. Thanks for the introductions and thanks for having us here. As I mentioned, I'm Merith. I use she, her pronouns. My family's from the UK. I'm also an immigrant, recent immigrant to this country, and I've been with UAM for 6 years now, and many of those now overlapping with Sernah and having the privilege to work with an extraordinary cohort of students all across the US and Canada, but we're part of now a global network with students organizing on their campuses in about 20 different countries. And I just wanted to start by saying someone mentioned revolution earlier, and I think this is what this is really about, and this is what we need, and I'm here for it, and I'm excited to talk to you all today. So, Sernah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. And thank you, Emily, for introducing me, and Merith for putting up with me for 4 years. But yeah, so I think, as Merith said, like revolution in this time, like begins with becoming educated on the issues and empowering ourselves with that. So I'm really excited that you are all here, like taking time out of your evening to like learn about these issues and learn about how we can be proactive on them. It's something that we're seeing, bless you, we're seeing so many people do on so many different issues this year because the urgency is there and the time is now. So I'm really, really excited to have you all here. All right, take it away, Merith.
Let's do this. You want to switch to the next slide? Yeah, so we're, as you all know, are in the middle of a global pandemic, but we thought that it would be important to also remind everyone, including myself, that this is the definition of health by the World Health Organization. It's a little old now, but this idea that health is in fact a state that is not just the absence of disease, because I think often we're thinking about that, but really it's just the full holistic meaning that is highlighted here, which I think is really important. And I know that even if we're not living or have survived COVID right now, for example, we are all living in a challenging moment, and I think we need to recognize that as we go forward, and just reinforce where we want to get to, right? What health really means. Yeah, next slide.
All right, so why medicines? This is kind of a basic question, but we definitely want to build from the ground up. So medicines are the foundations of any health system. Health technologies, which include medicines, but also walkers and mechanical aids and whatnot, they're all key elements to ensuring the right to health, especially when it comes to preventing and treating diseases. They're incredibly cost effective in terms of how much it costs to produce medicines and the benefit that patients can get, and they often have an immediate and long-lasting impact on individuals. Because they're a foundational element of health systems, it's really important to have policies and institutions that are responsible for providing these key elements of health to populations. Sorry.
So why do we focus on essential medicines? So essential medicines are really those that satisfy what we call the priority healthcare needs of a population, right? And this could vary for country to country or region to region. But we're not actually saying that everyone needs access to all the medicines in the market. That's not what we're not trying to push medicines on people. We know that sort of taking too many medicines can also be problematic, right? So it's about everyone needing access to the medicines they need when they need them, that can help save lives and promote well-being. And that's why we're fighting for universal access to medicines, which is a human right. Health is a human right, and sort of the basis of a lot of what we're focused on in this movement.
All right, so we're going to have a couple questions for y'all throughout the presentation, mostly at the beginning, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So if you want to say it out loud or put in the chat, please do. But the first question is, who funds what? When we talk about the production, research, and development of medicines, who funds this? If y'all have any ideas for this, please put it in the chat or just, unmute yourselves and holler at us. All right, so Monsieur Rodriguez says taxpayers, donors. We have taxpayers, public universities, the government, and big pharma. Let's see, tax dollars, government. All right, we have a well-educated audience. So a next question is, oh, sorry, let me answer your question.
Before we answer that, yeah, it's like specifically in who is the largest funder, right? So we're gonna answer that right here. So the largest funder of global biomedical R&D or research and development in the world, which is really sort of going to answer the question that Sernah
the first
posed.
question we posed. Yep.
Yeah.
Anybody have thoughts for who is the largest funder? Let's see, CDC. Okay. Is billionaires an answer to that? It's possible. Everything's within the realm of possibility. We have not the poor people for sure, very sadly, Marco. The NIH from Sernah. I think Sendra's getting somewhere. So to go ahead and answer that question, the largest funder of biomedical research in the world is the National Institutes of Health.
I think what's shocking is, we tend to ask this question of a lot of people, and you get, depending on the audience, there's a lot of like AstraZeneca or like, Gates maybe. But the reality is, even say pre-COVID, with all the additional funding, the NIH, which is the largest funder of global health research in the world, gave $41 billion in like annually to do basic research all the way through to clinical trials, right? About 1/3 of that $41 billion is spent on clinical trials for new drugs. If you look at other pharmaceutical corporations, it's going to be a lot less, and it won't come anywhere near what the NIH alone spends, not mentioning all the money that other governments are spending, which some are listed here. CIHR is the Canadian Institute of Health Research. I think the SRC is Scandinavian. Wellcome Trust, it's a fund out of the UK. The ones beginning with E are some of the, I think the European Commission, another European one. Who else am I missing on there?
I think you got most of them. I'm not really sure about MRC, so
we'll check.
That's my fault. But yeah, so a lot of these are, again, on a global scale. So we can see that the US alone, American taxpayers pay for about 65% of the biomedical research that's conducted across the globe, which is incredibly significant, especially when you consider the fact that drug prices in this country are the highest in the world. So another question. What percent of the FDA approved drugs between, let's say, 2010 and 2016 began their life with public funding? And of these same drugs, what percent do you think began their life with funding initiated at the private sector? So again, put your answers in the chat. We'd also love to hear your voices. Some of us are deprived of human connection. All right, so 95% public, 85% public, 15% private, 90% public, 10% private, 80-20, a good stake. Any other guesses? We have another 90% public. All right, it looks like we're hovering around 80 to 90, which is a really, really good, very reasonable guess. The actual answer is 100%. So between 2010 and 2016, there were 210 drugs approved by the FDA, and all of them began their life with public funding. 0% of them were initiated by funding that was given by the private sector.
Yeah, it's surprising for people. And I think this is from actually a study from the National Academies of Science. And you can look it up. We can share it otherwise to send around afterwards. And yeah, it was just looking at those drugs during that time period, which is why that time period is specified. But like this as a trend is what's happening with the most innovative drugs in the field right now. Do not be deceived.
All right, so who exactly is funding COVID-19 diagnostic, therapeutic, and vaccine development? Seeing as prior to the pandemic and within actually the past decade, we've seen an enormous contribution of taxpayer funds leading to the development and approval of these medicines. So is it any different this time around?
Good question, Sernah. What do you think?
I'm just gonna move on. No, it's not different. We as in taxpayers, we are still funding heavily the development of therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines to combat COVID-19. But what does that mean exactly? What does that mean for our access and for what role the government has in investing in this research? So I think we want to focus on one case study, which is a vaccine candidate that Johnson & Johnson have. So they made news a couple months ago by committing to a nonprofit vaccine, which means that they would price the vaccine at cost, the cost of production, to increase access to this vaccine. And they were going to do this for 1 billion doses. The reality behind the story is that US taxpayers already invested $500 million of public funds into the development of this vaccine. In addition, the not-for-profit price of for 1 billion doses comes out to $10 billion for J&J. Affordable, which is what they called this vaccine candidate, isn't affordable in most of the world, especially considering we are the richest country in the world with the highest GDP, and we have the most expensive drugs in the world as well. One other point, or actually 2 other points, is that a second dose might be required. So you can instantly double the amount of profit that they're able to make off of this vaccine. But also recall that we have about 7.5 billion people in the world. So if 1 billion people receive a not-for-profit price vaccine, what about the other 6.5 billion? I'm not good at fractions, but I think that 1 billion is a very small part of 7.5 billion.
And also the lesson I think here too is like to dig a little bit deeper. I'm sure based on everyone's responses, people are already doing this, but those tasty headlines that say, you know, free vaccine or non-profit vaccine, you're like, okay, let's find out actually what this pharmaceutical corporation has done versus what they say they're doing.
Exactly. But on this note, specifically on the note of 6.5 billion people not receiving an at-cost vaccine, I want to pose this question. How does our currently broken R&D, research and development system, perpetuate white supremacy and colonialism across the globe? I would love to get any answers, either in the chat or, you know, if you have something that you want to expand upon, please, 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 we'd love to hear your voice.
I'll jump in for a second so you could get a voice.
Yay.
Cool. I think the number one factor is just access, right? Because that's why I asked the question before. We have all of these vaccines, quote unquote, being free. However, they're free now because we are funding that research. However, once the quote unquote cure is found, then they're going to monetize and then privatize the vaccine itself. That's what I can predict that has happened before, and I can predict will maybe happen in the future as well. So a lot of times we know that people of the white race are those who have easier access to healthcare, either because of their fair skin just allows them to do that in those spaces, or because they have been set up in ways that they have the money to be able to afford this medication versus someone who is not of that race.
Great points, Marco. Do you want my job? Or sorry, Mr. Rodriguez.
I'll take it.
It's actually all volunteer. So, anybody else have any responses? That was really great. I see in the chat we have really good
This is
points.
Marco. Can you hear me, Sernah?
Yes, yes.
Since you mentioned my name, I wanted to say very quickly that that we can that racism is really what drives and every action that these folks take. Here in the U.S., what happened with Gilead was very clear that, you know, we basically put them out, and although I don't do that with my colleagues, we put them on the spot because that's the least that they can deal with that, right? And yet they found most of the stuff going around on HIV, most of the nonprofit, most of the groups that we work on HIV/AIDS here in the US, the money comes from big pharma. And so it's a very difficult situation that we're placed. And some of us don't take any money for pharma, but I bet you that every single person that works with HIV, if you go to an event, if you go to a webinar, most of the time those things are funded by the very same people that are taking, that are making great profits with your pain.
Ditto.
I think, and the connection, I think that link, especially with a lot of patient groups as well, right, is that challenge where people want access to the medicines, but they're also then supporting a system that isn't working in their favor.
So I want to read some of the chat responses before moving on, but I see a lot of responses that say, let's see, via racism, by IP and patents, which is an amazing point, leaving indigenous and racialized people behind, making people dependent on countries like the US that have funding for pharmaceuticals. Emily, leaving Black and indigenous people of color out of vaccine trials, leaving pregnant women out of trials. These are all amazing points. And I just want to say that when it comes to how they perpetuate white supremacy and colonialism, my own personal take is that they are high-income countries like the US and like others that have the money for pharmaceutical funding but don't prioritize access. They employ a very familiar colonial power dynamic where they have the resources and exploit those who are dependent, as someone said in the chat. And oftentimes they double down and extract as much profit as they can from the colonized people. And I think that has been demonstrated very clearly in the past couple of months. One thing that I did want to touch on, actually, small side point, well, it's not that small, but regarding vaccine trials and who was let in, we see sexism at work when we see that pregnant women aren't allowed to participate in vaccine trials, but still need access to vaccine like any other population. But also we see the desire for colonial powers to extract as much profit and to exploit people in the global South and in Black and brown countries. In the past couple of months, we actually saw a lot of people floating the idea around that people in South Africa or different sub-Saharan African countries should be the first to receive a vaccine candidate, or sorry, rather, to be the first to be part of a vaccine study. And that is incredibly insulting when you think about the power dynamics and also when you think about how access to the vaccine isn't prioritized for a lot of those countries. So we're seeing this colonial power play at work, and the pharmaceutical industry, like many institutions within high-income countries and Western countries, exploits this for the sake of profit.
Yeah, I would add on the last slide before we move ahead, actually, there's other ways as well, systematically, that we talk about at UAM in particular, is about where the dollars go, right? So we're not investing into things like neglected tropical diseases, because who do they impact? Historically, it's impacted poor people, women, people of color. And so like you're going to see more money going into diseases of historically whiter and wealthier populations versus others. And also I should mention, I think Aparna, you mentioned in the notes, women being included in clinical trials. There's, I looked here because I don't have the book right here, but someone we're working with actually in the Free the Vaccine campaign that you'll hear about later, who was part of ACT UP at that time. They, I'll see if I can grab it. I have the images that they use to basically convince the CDC. They say women don't get AIDS, they just die from it, was the message that they included around that time, around HIV and AIDS, and also this piece as well. But that is another session, but we'll keep moving.
All right, so last point on this, we've talked a lot about the role of taxpayers and the public as initial investors. So what happens with this investment? I think someone actually in the chat earlier, when we asked the question about how pharmaceutical industry perpetuates white supremacy and colonialism, we saw someone answered IP and patents, and I was like, yes, they're thinking ahead. But yeah, so after initially investing, a lot of the products of our basic science research is patented, which inherently restricts access and provides exclusivities, which enables monopoly profiteering. And finally, something that we're seeing a lot, especially in the COVID arms race to a vaccine, we're seeing a lot of confidentiality around data, around pricing, and this creates a system where there is no accountability. And that is by design, because it is their intention to make it as hard as possible for us to be able to advocate for our rights to be able to access essential medicine.
So certainly those folks in the US will recognize this chap who is the head of HHS, Health and Human Services, but he's also the former head of Eli Lilly, and he saw insulin prices increase under his tenure at one of the 3 largest manufacturers of insulin worldwide that control 96% of the market. So as we say, it's sort of like the fox trying to guard the hen house, right? And when asked by Congress here in the US whether or not he could guarantee that even with billions of dollars of public funds going into COVID research and development, could he guarantee that it would be available to the public who pay for it? And he said on record, he couldn't guarantee that. So no reassurances here, as we said. This is, you know, it's not a secret. They have no interest, but it also points to the revolving door and the corruption between government and big pharma. And knowing also that here in Washington, where I am, there are 2 lobbyists for big pharma per congressperson on average. So just think of the billions of dollars that are spent. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. So we're up against a lot. Yeah. So, okay, this is a good one. Anyone know who said this fairly recently? Take a wild guess. It could be, you know, just literally anyone.
For accessibility purposes, I'm going to read it. It says, it would be a scandal if our economic system supported by public funds contributes only to companies instead of the public good.
I was trying to close the chat so I could read it. I was being very slow, so I couldn't see.
Peter Pyatt.
He's head of London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Oh, okay.
And some
Got
other,
it.
he's written a book. He got COVID actually recently. He was the supposedly the first person, first European, let's say, to write about Ebola.
Any other guesses? 45's cabinet. Trump doesn't have the range.
I mean, he had said he wants to lower drug prices, and then he does the opposite. So it's a good, fair guess, right?
Listen to what he does, not what he
Yeah,
says.
yeah, we can go to
Any
that.
other guesses? Merith, should we spoil it?
Let's do the big reveal. It was the Pope. Yeah. Yeah, this guy's been on to a few things. Yeah, interesting, no? This was fairly recently, but the Pope has got in on the action. So, but it is interesting that folks of all different backgrounds are now speaking up about the need for a global vaccine that is for the people, by the people. So let's keep moving.
All right, so we presented a lot of issues around the R&D system, around the funding and access, et cetera. So we want to get into whether or not this is pandemic specific. This is a rhetorical question, so we don't have to take a lot of answers in the chat, but of course, feel free to answer if you'd like. But the answer is unfortunately no, this is not COVID-19 specific. For the past couple of decades, we've seen insulin prices rising astronomically, as we have also seen with the EpiPen, which actually had increased almost overnight under the tenure of one CEO. And the picture of the guy in the middle on your screen is actually of a Martin Shkreli. I'm sure y'all have heard of him. He's also affectionately called Pharma Bro. In I think 2015, he raised a price of a drug, about 700% almost overnight. And while it was an absolute egregious act, it really demonstrated the or how arbitrarily pharmaceutical drug prices are set, and how they can be increased at a moment's notice without any accountability or transparency or link to production costs.
I was just gonna say, Sernah, I think they put it up to $700 and something, but it was like a 5,000% increase. It was, yeah, even bigger than that. But it was, you're right, 700 was what they moved the price up to.
All right, so this is again talking about, this is the study that we referenced earlier by the Center for Integration of Science and Industry that looked at the contribution of NIH funding to new drugs in 2010 to 2016. So again, this just underscores the fact that public funding is absolutely inherent to our current R&D system. But there is no role currently for the public in terms of assuring access.
So wait, Sernah, I don't have a clue what really goes into a vaccine. So wait, where are these funds going?
Enter universities.
So a lot of people wonder why we have universities in our name, Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and this is why. Because we see universities as that critical point in the drug pipeline system. It's really actually sort of like the jujitsu move, like if you were going to bring the system down, this is a way that we believe there is an opportunity here to address the entire drug pipeline system. And that's because every year, as we mentioned, there was that $41 billion of just in NIH alone. So if we think of the US, goes to about 2,500 universities in every state and in a number of different countries around the world, and many different medical schools to do medical research, from basic research all the way through to clinical trials. As we've already mentioned, universities are heavily funded by the taxpayer. And in theory, they have social missions. But I am yet to be convinced that a university in this country really has a social mission, because from the evidence that we've seen, at least in terms of R&D and making medicines affordable to people, we do not see universities moving in this direction, right? This is why they only do it if there's support and student advocacy or pressure, right? So this is why we tackle universities, because students are really critically placed to actually meet with their administrations in a way that even like an organization like our allies, Doctors Without Borders, who are a $2 billion global organization, they can't get the meetings that our students can, because our students have a right, or students have a right to meet with their administrations and ask them to do things that outside actors cannot. Let's see. Do you want to switch to the next slide? So also, yeah, the previous one as well, in mentioning like of the most innovative drugs, most of those are developed on a university campus with taxpayer money, right? And oops, we're sliding around on some of these slides, but also we tackle universities and we focus on them as a key point, because we know that the most important medicines, those that are most innovative, so not what we call Me Too drugs, that may be an additional drug that is just a competitor for one that is already exists. And this is what a lot of big pharmaceutical corporations will engage with and eventually develop, because they basically want a piece of the pie that already exists. They're not interested in developing new drugs for diseases in the way that the public takes on that risk. I'm going to take the next slide. Yeah.
All right, so to underscore a bit of what Merith said, I want to get into UAIM's origin story. So let's go back to 2001, right around the corner of, or right past the corner of Y2K, at a little school called Yale. Someone actually made a point in the chat that Yale did a lot of the R&D for HIV drugs, and it's like, y'all are reading our minds. But D4T, also known as stavudine, was an antiretroviral medication that was developed to treat HIV. It was discovered by Yale scientists and later licensed to Bristol Myers Squibb, a large pharmaceutical company. Bristol Myers Squibb then priced the drug at $1,600 per person per year in South Africa. At this point, most South Africans were unable to access antiretroviral drugs, which were the newest innovation discovered to combat HIV, and they weren't able to access it due to the price. MSF, also known as Doctors Without Borders, really wanted to seek to drive down the price of this medication so that they could treat people in South Africa and throughout sub-Saharan Africa for the first time. Again, it was discovered by Yale scientists, and there were students at the university who didn't like the role that their university was playing. They essentially thought of all of Yale as complicit in the difficulties that people around the world were having in accessing D4T. Because students, again, are uniquely posed to influence what's done at their institutions, they pushed the university through a really negative PR campaign because the university said that nothing could be done. They said that we've already licensed the drug out. This is the price that Bristol Myers Squibb has set, and there's nothing that we can do about this. But those students decided that the status quo wasn't all right and launched that PR campaign. Sorry, my slides aren't going. All right. After months of public pressure, Yale finally agreed to use non-exclusive licensing for D4T in order to bring down the costs. The non-exclusive licensing basically enables for a generic version of the same drug to be made by another manufacturer, whereas exclusive licensing allows whatever intellectual property it is to be manufactured by one entity. this was an incredibly powerful move that actually ended up in the decrease of the price of the drug about 90% overnight, which allowed Doctors Without Borders to treat people living with HIV in South Africa for the very first time. And this was actually the beginnings of UAIM. So looking at the taxpayer as an investor and universities as the first point of essentially investment, we have to really think about how the taxpayers as stakeholders are receiving a return on their investment. If any of you have stocks, you know that like it's incredibly important to think about how much you're getting out for how much you're putting in. Since 2000, I believe the NIH has actually spent over $100 billion into research that has contributed to 210 drugs approved by the FDA. Two of those drugs, or sorry, one of those drugs is actually Xtandi. Xtandi, also known as enzalutamide, is a late-stage prostate cancer drug that was developed by scientists at UCLA. And it was wholly funded by grants from the NIH and the Department of Defense. When this drug was brought to market, it was priced for $129,000 per patient per year in the US and $29,000 in Canada. UCLA, a public university receiving public funds and a university with a social mission, actually gave up their royalty rights and sold them to a essentially like an equity or pharmaceutical equity firm, but then later sued India, which is a large generic producer of generic drugs. They sued them for patent rights in India. Mind you, in India, the price of the drug was many times greater than the per capita income. So we're not seeing a public return on public investment either domestically nor globally, because again, we can look back at the chain of development and see that the initial investment comes from the public. But when the public wants to access the products of what they've invested into, they have to cough up $130,000 if they're living in the US.
We should mention too that we've asked UAIM students in UCLA and some of the UC system have been fighting UCLA and have been able to push the university and the UC system now to change their licensing. So we're in a debate now to try and get the best possible licensing for all new drugs that are coming out of the university, which is a huge win, although it's not finalized yet, but it will help prevent this happening again in the future. But that's like a whole other conversation, but if we have time, we can talk about it at the end, because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for adding that point. I want to quickly say that this is not a phenomenon, or at least the lack of return of investment is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to newer drugs or to biologics. Insulin, which was developed at the University of Toronto, a public institution, is now almost $300 a vial, and the prices of insulin have continued to go up, not only for Americans, but also for Canadians as well, which have the second highest prices in the world. So what we're seeing here is an incredibly profit-centered system. And the profit-centered system works against us in many ways. First is the decreased access to the products that we invest in, but another is the increasing development of drugs to serve predominantly white and wealthy populations, as opposed to drugs that will treat ailments that affect Black, brown, and impoverished people. For example, for this graphic, in the past 30 years, over 1,500 drugs were made, and only about 20 were made for neglected diseases. Neglected diseases are those that affect large populations across the world, but don't have a proportional amount of research and development dollars attributed to them. And that is often due to the amount of profit that companies believe that they can get from a drug that treats those populations. So when we look at all these different problems and facets of the system, as we have come to realize with many things in our world, we must revolutionize this system, and we must replace it with one that centers people and health needs rather than profits and stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks, Sernah. So just to wrap up here, I think what we're seeing with COVID is it really has shed light on the sort of global biomedical R&D system and the way we make medicines, right? We're seeing that actually all the failures, it's failed everyone pretty much everywhere. And the people who are benefiting seem to be primarily those people that have stocks and shares in the massive pharmaceutical corporations, but those are the only folks right now. If you go to the next slide, you'll see just some of the headlines from all different countries around the world, some of which you've probably seen already, but just how the current system is also leading to a lot of fear and panic. We've already mentioned the challenges with access, but we're also seeing challenges in access because high-income countries are buying up all of the medicine. And I think it was the UK has now bought sort of 5 times the amount of vaccine, even though we don't have it yet, than is needed, whereas other countries are going to go without. And so we actually back in April launched this campaign, Free the Vaccine for COVID-19, with 2 goals. But the primary goal around ensuring that publicly funded diagnostics, tools, and treatment, and the vaccine would be sustainably priced, so governments wouldn't be price gouged, available to all. That means sort of everyone, everywhere, regardless of insurance status, regardless of immigration status, and free at the point of delivery. And we don't say free because we already paid for it anyway, right? So that's kind of like the key piece. But if you go to the next slide, I think we have 1 or 2 left. This was what we mentioned earlier, this idea, we were talking about white supremacy and sort of the white supremacist system and colonial system and the powers that be. The way that we're accessing the vaccine or the approach to it through governments right now around the world is that we're using this term vaccine sovereignty, because it really is just an instrument of power being used to deployed to exercise control over life and death, meaning governments, high-income governments in particular, decide who is going to have access, therefore who lives and who will not. And we've seen this throughout history, of course, but I think using this term is a helpful way to describe to people what we really mean and how this is shaping out, which is why we need global collaboration, and we need a process that isn't an America first, it isn't a Germany first or a UK first approach. It needs to be something different, and that's why we're sort of rallying around a people's vaccine, which we're part of that alliance right now with other large organizations much bigger than us. And then, yeah, I think that will wrap it up there. So we have 1 more slide, I think. That's sort of what we've mentioned here, but I think just looking at the time, we have a couple minutes. If you're interested with this campaign, what we're doing is urging universities all around the world. We have people who have joined us. You don't have to have any technical expertise. You could know nothing, but you just want to have some agency in what is happening to you right now and all of us, and want to be part of the solution. And we are inviting folks to join us. And we're in our 2nd cohort now. And we're working to urge universities to sign something called the Open COVID Pledge, which basically means that all of their IP will be free, so that we can help to end the pandemic as quickly as possible. And we know that from what we've explained today as well, that IP serves as a primary barrier to access. And then there's this other thing called CTAP, which is another ridiculous name, but it is essentially the COVID Technology Access pool where you pool patents, but we don't need to go into that right now. But ultimately, this is something that the WHO or the World Health Organization has endorsed. And these are two mechanisms that we're pushing for, but in a very creative way, because we're working with an organization called the Center for Artistic Activism. And part of our focus is to use culture and creativity to impact power. And that's what we're doing right now. There's a couple of images here that have been created by our participants. We should have shared the Jolene video, but we can share that at some time just for some of the musical relief. And we could talk about this all day, but I realize time is really short, and hopefully we can have time for a few more questions, because I feel like there were a lot in the chat and we talked a lot. So just to wrap it up quickly, there's a lot more we could go into detail on, and happy to answer questions also after today. But that's kind of where we thought we would land for the moment. So thanks.
Thank you all so much for engaging with us this entire time. You made it super fun. Please feel free to follow us. I believe these are all Twitter accounts.
Instagram, I think, Twitter.
Yeah, these are all, okay, well, mine is a Twitter account. I'm going to put in the right handle for the People's Vaccine. It's just an S after people. So definitely follow us and look at what we're doing. That's a collaboration with Free the Vaccine, Oxfam, some other groups that are working towards the same goal.
Yeah, UNAIDS.
Yes, UNAIDS.
Yeah.
Yeah, please, if anybody has any questions.
Question.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of the ACTG?
The AIDS Institute?
No, the ACTG.
ACTG. No, beyond the actual biological significance, I don't believe I've heard of the group.
The AIDS Clinical Trials Group, the global AIDS Clinical Trials Group. So I belong, right?
I'm so
Okay.
sorry.
ACTG.
I think you're kind of breaking up a little bit. Can you repeat what you said?
So I am a member of that group.
Uh-huh.
I think we could have some conversations, because there's some things that I can do for you and there's some things that you do for us.
Sounds great. We'd love to. Should I put my email in the chat?
Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Who else has questions? I know there are some higher up here. I'm trying to sift through and find them. But if you had a question, maybe like re-ask it in the chat, or you can ask it with the voice, whatever's easier. And I know that, like, honestly, like each one of these things we could go into a lot of depth on. Like this was like, I was like, oh no, we have to rush through at the end. But I wanted to make sure we covered it, like the basics. But we'd be happy to talk to folks, and we have lots of materials if people would like to talk to us or talk more. How can we help? Well, also, Jason and Emily are sort of part of the broader network of advising us with Free the Vaccine, and hopefully we're going to have another cohort of volunteers if you want to play a role. But we will have, if you sign up on freethevaccine.org, you can get a weekly update of what's going on and actions around COVID-19 that you can take to push governments, to push pharmaceutical corporations, to push universities to do the right thing and be part of the solution. Actually, on Thursday, there's going to be a video coming out of COVID survivors from all around the world that we'll be sharing via the People's Vaccine handle. And that's something that I think would be a first action to take. And if you're a student, join us. Also, one more thing, actually. This weekend we have our conference. It's open to everyone. It's free. You can sign up on the homepage, uam.org. Linda Mafu, who is from South Africa, who's at the Global Fund, will be talking. She's our keynote speaker, and we have other speakers from around the world and in the US and Canada as well. So you can join that if you want more of us, but it won't just be me and Sernah, luckily.
We promise.
It's gonna be a catch-22 because I'm a community member, but I also represent a university. So
Okay.
it's catch-22 for me.
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? It's the challenge. But there are good people at universities. We know that. We have a lot of allies trying to force the people at the top to do the right thing. Because Big Pharma has their tentacles in the university.
But I don't work for the hospital. I did for the university. I don't work for the university / hospital.
Okay.
But in global conferences, I'm the community member that goes.
Okay. Yeah. You know how that goes.
Yeah.
I look forward to talking.
I have a question quickly. So we've been there's when is it when a vaccine does come out, what is the likely, I know you talked about this a little bit, but what is like the range of prices for a COVID vaccine?
Really good question. I think it depends on who, right, is delivering it. Yeah, that's the big question. I think some have been priced, like if you look, the best thing to do is to look at what they did, Gilead did with remdesivir, right? Like that is not even, it's not a vaccine, it's a treatment, it's not super effective anyway. And that was priced at $3,000. So I would.
That was a treatment. That was a treatment.
But they're giving it like for example, let me say for example, I'm in New York. I'm in upstate New York. I was just told in in a community meeting and in a staff meeting that we need Black and brown people to come to the trials. And me as the outreach person that has to go get them, that actually don't believe in the trial. It's a dance that you have to do.
Yeah, and I think we've been talking in this country, in the US at least, to a lot of folks who are saying they don't want to take a vaccine just for very valid reasons, based on history, etc., but also because of the current administration. So I think that's going to be an additional challenge, whereas that probably isn't the same kind of conversation you're going to have in a different part of the world, right?
Yeah, that's a huge point. I think Merith and I were just talking yesterday. It's kind of a multi-pronged battle in that we are fighting for access, but we're also fighting to increase public confidence in any kind of vaccine, whether that's in the populations that are enrolled in the trials or who's going to receive it first. I think it's incredibly complicated, unfortunately, because of misinformation and political influences. But that is something that we have to fight along with fighting for access. One thing I want to say,
I would say if we have a different government for the U.S., we have a different government, then people would probably jump to try. But
more so
things are going.
That's how we're remembering it right now, is pets. A pet's vaccine, not for pets, but proven, effective, tested, and safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what we're going to want.
I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on what Emily said earlier regarding the pricing of vaccines. Merith is 100% right that it does depend on who. I think that we have seen that for typical vaccines, including polio, some of them common cold, they're usually priced at about $2 to $3 a dose. This is different in that there is a lot of money from a lot of different corporations and institutions that is going into the research, and I'm not exactly sure how that's going to influence pricing. But for some of the ones that we've seen that have already set a price, or have received maybe a lump sum for a promised amount of doses, including the Moderna vaccine. We're seeing that vaccine priced at about $10 a pop or up to $20 a pop. So looking at a typical vaccine price of a couple dollars a dose, we're already seeing that this is much more expensive and less provisions for access.
Yeah, I think the other thing that there are question marks around, and again in the US, is around these insurance fees, like administrative fees and like delivery fees, that if there's a way that they can add something, currently there are limited restrictions, right, on that. But don't put it past big like look at the evidence of what they've done before, and that is your best indicator of what they will do again. You know, there's no reason. People think global pandemic, this is different, but you know, AIDS is still a pandemic. Like Ebola, you know, it just people not everyone everywhere felt that they were impacted by it, but we're still living those too, as you all know.
I feel like I have so many questions. Like I feel like I had questions throughout, but now I'm just like thinking about COVID and everything, and it's a lot of information.
But I will say, to leave it on a positive note, I do feel that, you know, around the Alliance for the People's Vaccine, there is a lot of organizations and leaders that started with a letter with 140 world leaders signing on, saying like this needs to be the people's vaccine. You know, Nobel laureates, luminaries, and former government leaders around the world. So I think there is a groundswell with groups like Free the Vaccine of very ordinary people like ourselves, and then people who are leading nations who are getting on board with these ideas. So there is hope.
And I will say that like I feel like Jason and I have said this before, but just it bears repeating that these, like, the goal of sharing, of bringing in these great speakers like Merith and Sernah is that we want people to have a good basic understanding of what we're fighting against and what the lay of the land is, right? And then ideally our goal together as a group is to be part of campaigns and taking actions to change these systems, right? So this education is like the very first step. It's just the beginning of our work that we're doing together, and it will we'll definitely want to hear from people about like, how can we take action? How do we build a campaign together? And that's going to come further down the line. But just so everyone knows, there will be actions, there will be things to do, and we want to do that with you, alongside you. So that is.
And you will be speaking on the weekend at the conference too, so they can catch you there too.
Yeah, please register for the UAEM conference. I'll be teaching people how to have a great meeting. I was like, what am I doing? How to have a meeting with your representatives, your members of Congress. So if you want to learn how to do that, I will be teaching that, and there will be, or Jason will be too. We're doing that together actually. And yeah, you'll learn lots of important things from their conference. So please do register. So I know that some people, including me, are going to watch the presidential debate tonight, which has kicked off. So I do want to let people go, even if you're not doing that. But thank you so much again to Merith and Sernah for this great presentation and sharing all this info. Before we head out, I like to do the thing at the end where everyone shares like a word that they're taking away with them, like what's something that you learned or something that you're feeling from leaving here tonight. Yeah, I'm sure either out loud or in the chat. Either way is good.
More work to be done.
Feel better informed.
I'm ready to take action. Cool, we got time to revolt. Yes. shocked, but also better informed and headful, fueled.
Love fuel.
Yeah.
There's a free video I think on YouTube called "Drugs: The Price We Pay." That's a nice, like, I don't know, 70 minutes documentary in the last couple of years as well that you can look at. So yeah.
And Merith and Sernah, will you share your slides with us and any other like reading materials or resources that people should have?
Yes, and I think it looks like, Sernah, we can see your screen, so you're pulling up the video for us to put in the chat.
You can see that I'm Googling.
Yeah. Yes, we can share the slides, and we're happy to share, more, that we have a lot of information, because I know it can be a little bit overwhelming, but hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming.
Thank you, Tiffany. I haven't heard of that book. It's another one to add to my list.
Well, thank you guys so much again, and hope to see everyone Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time for Direct Action Organizing for Public Health. We'll have Sandy Nurse with us, one of the founders of Mayday Space and BK Rot. And then on Friday at noon, we also have a community movement building space where we'll meet at noon and just get to know each other better, like go into questions that we have about this stuff, ideas we might have. Pretty much a continuation of these conversations, but less of a presentation, more of just chatting with each other. So hope you are able to make both of those things this week. But thank you everyone so much for joining again, and thank you, Sernah and Merith. Appreciate you.
Nice to meet you.
Everyone, have fun.
Be safe. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.